Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the second in a two-part episode on words that come from the reg-root in Indo-European. Just a quick recap for what we talked about in the first half of this safari. The reg-root is a root or a word in Indo-European that means straight, and we get all sorts of words from this in the Indo-European languages, including Latin and English, and some other ones that we looked at in the last episode. In this episode, we're going to focus exclusively on words that come from Latin and what Latin did with the reg-root. As you know, we borrowed a lot of words from Latin. Now, some of them came directly from Latin, some of them came through French and came from French and ultimately come from Latin. We're going to be looking at both of these today. Just a brief discussion of something that Latin does, just like many languages. Latin is a language that is able to make adjectives out of verbs. And when it makes adjectives out of verbs, those adjectives we usually call participles. You don't need to worry about why that is or what that word means, except that these are adjectives that come from verbs. So for instance, if you have a verb like straighten, to straighten something, once you have straightened something, it is straightened, and straightened is an adjective that describes that thing as a result of a past action that has happened to it. So that's basically how we take verbs and make adjectives out of them. We do it in every language. English just did it the way that I showed you or told you about. The way that you would do this in Latin is to add an ending like tum to the verb root. And it's slightly more complicated than that, but that's usually what you would do. So for a verb like rego, which just meant to rule or sometimes to straighten, if something was ruled or straightened, you would add tum to the end of the reg root and you would get rectum. It would be normal for the G to turn into a K sound before the T for some phonological reasons. And if you're a linguist, you probably know what's going on here. But that's totally normal in Latin and many other languages as well. So a word like rectum would literally just mean straight, or having been straightened. The verb rego has been done to it. It has been straightened, and now it is in a state of being straight. And that's all that word would mean. So let's look at a number of words that we get from this Latin past participle, rectum. The first one that's probably coming into your head and has come into the head of all of us since we were in middle school, of course, and thought this was really funny is rectum, all right? We have this word rectum. It's actually short for intestinum rectum, so originally it was an adjective and not a noun. So intestine is the noun there. Rectum is the adjective that describes which part of the intestine we're talking about. We're talking about the straight part of the intestine. So if you've ever looked at an intestine, obviously the small intestines are very windy. Then the large intestine kind of does like this, as you can see in the picture there. And then at the very end of it, there is a straight part, and that is called the rectum intestine, because it's the straight part of the intestine. That's really all that word means. When you dig into a lot of these scientific and anatomical words, they actually are kind of duh moments when you look at what they mean, because they make a lot of sense. The scientists who named them weren't being very creative. So our word rectum, which again has induced laughter in generations of middle schoolers, really just means straight. That's all that word means, and it comes from this past participle from the reg root. What else do we get from this? We get rectangle. You see the reg there in the rect in rectangle. What is a rectangle? It's just a shape made up of right angles. You have right angles at the corners of it. Why do we call them right angles? This goes back to what we were talking about in the last episode, where in this sense, right means normal or standard or what you can expect or what you can count on, the usual. All right, so that's what we're really talking about when we talk about right angles. And rectangle is kind of just a translation of right angle, or vice versa, because they both basically mean the same thing and come from the same root. You can rectify something. What do you do when you rectify something? You literally make it straight or you make it right. There's that connection again between rect and right, because right is really just a translation of rect oftentimes. These if-I words like magnify come from Latin, and the if-I comes from a Latin word that means to make. So when you if-I anything, you are making it the first part. So rectify just means to make right, just like magnify means to make great or to make bigger if you magnify something with a magnifying glass. What if you are characterized by rectitude? This is probably not a word you throw around all the time, but what is rectitude? It's uprightness. And notice again, I've translated it with our word right. So we keep seeing these words all over the place to translate each other, which makes sense. So rectitude is uprightness of character, morality, integrity, things like that. Who is a rector? A rector is literally someone who straightens you out, but also someone who rules, whether ruling a university or a particular religious group. We see this word in multiple contexts. Either way, that's basically what a rector does, and you can see why a rector would be called that. So a rector and a rex which is, again, the Latin word for king, are not that different, except a rector is a little more general. It's somebody who rules a particular group and maybe disciplines them and straightens them out like a leader often would. Let's talk a little bit more about what Latin does with this root, this reg-root. So we've seen that it can make past participles that have rect in them, and we just looked at a bunch of words from that. But something else Latin can do is it makes compounds with its verbs. Now, Latin is not the only Indo-European language that likes to make compounds with its verbs in a particular way, and the way that it makes compounds with its verbs oftentimes is to put something like a preposition on the front of the verb to modify its meaning in some way. So, for instance, in English, we have the verb play. You can play in many different ways, and that's a regular verb we have, but you can put a preposition down on the front of that verb and modify the meaning of the verb and get a kind of new verb out of it, right? So down is a preposition, like I'm going down the street, but when you downplay something, you're playing it down, or you're saying it's not that important. So that's a pretty obvious metaphor that we're using. In fact, it's not really much of a metaphor at all. But then you get more complicated compounds that are really quite a bit metaphorical, like undertake, where you have the verb take. You can take something. That's a normal verb we use. And then you have the preposition under, like you're under something. But then you put those two together, and it doesn't necessarily literally mean you're taking something under. All right, it's a little more complicated than that when you undertake something. And if you're having to explain this verb, for instance, to somebody who is learning English for the first time, they would probably have questions about it. They would probably be like, what does this have to do with taking something under? And you'd have to be like, no, it's a little more complicated than that. There's actually something going on here. There's been a semantic shift. Latin has both of these types of compounds. Sometimes when Latin will put a preposition onto a verb, the meaning of that verb is really just the sum of those two parts, like down, play means to play something down in some way. And sometimes it's a little more metaphorical, like undertake does not just mean to take under. It is more complicated than that because there is a metaphorical shift that's going on there. So Latin has lots of compounds. Latin loves to do this even more than English does. So we're going to look at a bunch of different compounds that Latin makes from this verb rego or rectum by putting some kind of preposition on the front. And then we have gotten so many words from some of these Latin compounds that come from the rego root. Let's look at the first one. This is actually where we ended our last safari, the first half of this safari, when we were looking at a bunch of reg words. We got to the word right, and then one of the ways I translated right was correct, and I said actually the reg root is hiding in there, so we kind of went around full circle. So now we're back to where we left off at the end of the last safari. So Cor-rect is one of these Latin compounds. Now, of course, correct means right, or literally all straightened out. What is this compound made up of in Latin? It's made up of the preposition cone, which sometimes shows up as cum and cone are the same preposition in Latin, plus the rect that we have been seeing. So cone literally means with. If you know any Spanish, cone means with, and so that's the same word that they still have in Spanish today. It can mean together, because if you're with somebody, you're together with them, so that kind of makes sense. But it can also have an intensifying force, like completely, totally. So if something is cone-rect, and then that N will assimilate to the R, which is why you spell correct with two R's. The first one is actually what's left of the N in cone. So if something is cone-rect or Cor-rect, it's totally straightened out. Completely right. It's not just right, it's completely right. That's the original etymological meaning of the word correct. So it comes from one of these Latin compound verbs. We get another word, incorrigible, from this particular Latin compound, and this is great because it's made up of 4 different parts, and we can talk about what each of those 4 parts mean, although you can probably guess what some of them are already. The very first part, the in part, comes from a Latin word that means not. So Latin actually has 2 words in. One of them means in, and we're going to talk about that in a few slides here, and one of them means not. So they're actually 2 totally different words, not related to each other. This is the one that means not. If you're incapable, for instance, you are not capable. So it's that kind of in. So in is not, cor is cone, that's the same cone we were looking at. Rig is actually just the reg root that's hiding a little bit here in the middle. Notice the E in the reg root has changed to an I in this particular instance. That's a normal thing that happens in Latin, so don't worry about it. And then the able part is actually just able. So when you put all 4 parts of this word together, or all 4 morphemes, if you know linguistics slang here, uh, then what all this means is unable to be straightened out. That's really what this word means. So if you're incorrigible, you can't be corrected. You refuse to be corrected. We kind of often use this in kind of a playful way today. Like if a kid is being funny, we'll say, oh, that kid is incorrigible. Or if you're causing trouble, you're being incorrigible or something like that. But literally, it means unable to be corrected. Let's keep going here. Another Latin compound is erect, and this comes from another preposition plus the rect root. So a or x, and it can be spelled both ways in Latin, means out or from. And then, of course, rect, we've seen, means straight. So literally, something that is erect is something that is straightened out, and to erect something is to straighten it out. Now, the semantics have shifted a little bit on this one, because something that is erect is not just straightened out but raised, and the idea seems to be that if you straighten something out from the perspective of the ground, then you are raising it up. So you can see how this word that literally means straighten out came to mean something like raise when you erect a building, or I don't know what else you would erect. This is a family program, so we're going to leave it there. Here's another compound, direct. Direct comes from disrect, and in Latin, dis means away from. So this is a slightly different meaning than erect, but it's kind of in the same family of words because that preposition on the front isn't super different. So literally, if you translate direct, it means straightened away from something else. What are some ways that we use this in English? We use it as an adjective. Direct as an adjective literally means straight away from one place to another. If you get a direct flight from one place to another, you're going straight there. You're not making any stops. So you're flying straight away from one place to another place. And so you can kind of see how those morphemes, those parts of the Latin words there, still have meaning on your direct flights from, say, New York to San Francisco. Direction comes from this. A direction is a straight line away from one place. So if you point north, that's a straight line that you're pointing at, right? So you can see how that would mean a straight line from where I am to somewhere else. That's a direction. How else do we use this word in English? We use it as a verb. If you direct something or if you direct somebody, it's a very similar concept. You're straightening something away from one place or situation toward a specific goal. So this can be used, again, both spatially. If you are directing somebody somewhere, you're pointing them in the right direction. There's that word again we were just talking about. If you are a director, you are somebody who directs something, and you may not be literally directing people in a specific direction on the compass, but you are directing them in a specific direction toward a future goal. So it's less spatial and more temporal when you do that, but you can see how that would be a word that comes from this Latin compound that means to straighten somebody away from one situation toward a particular, hypothetically better situation, a goal that you are trying to get to. Now, French got a hold of this word and did some really interesting things with this word, and took it phonologically in some directions that you might not expect. So late Latin came up with the verb direct-iare, which just comes from this word direct. So this was not a word in classical Latin. Late Latin, vulgar Latin, the spoken Latin of the late Roman imperial period had this word direct-iare, and no surprise, it meant to direct or straighten or arrange something. Now, again, French got a hold of this, and it went through some typical French sound changes. Now, one of the things that French did to T's before I's, as in direct-iare, is it palatalized them. What that means is it made the T into a T, and then eventually just an S sound. That's what it means to palatalize. So what French did to direct-iare is it cut out the first I in direct and just made it direct, because that's easier to say. And then what it did to that T is it made it more of a T sound. So direct-iare became direct-iare, and that would have been the original French way to pronounce this, maybe with the R still pronounced there at the end. Later on, that direct-iare or something like that evolved into dresser, and that's how you would pronounce this in modern French. You can probably already see where we're going with this and what word we got from this in modern English. We actually got dress from this. So you would never guess that dress comes from the same root as direct way back in Latin, but it actually does. Now, the original meaning of dress was just to direct others. So when this verb was originally borrowed into English, it could still mean to direct something or to direct others. But what happens when you straighten yourself up? You're not straightening others out, but you're straightening yourself up. Let's say you get up in the morning. what do you do after you brush your teeth and take a shower? You get dressed. The original meaning of getting dressed was to straighten yourself up, make yourself presentable, which, for most of us involves putting on clothes. So you can see how this word that meant to straighten things up and straighten yourself up came to mean the primary thing that you do once you wake up to straighten yourself up, which is to put on clothes, right? So that's where our word dress comes from, and then it evolved further from there as a noun. So we have the verb dress, to straighten yourself out, literally. The noun dress is your straightened out look. Once you have straightened yourself up, you are dressed, hopefully. Right? And then later on, it came to evolve to mean a particular kind of dress, like something a woman would wear, a dress, right? But that was a much later evolution of that term. This will help you understand if you've ever wondered why dress and dressage look so similar, because dressage, which is the training of horses, doesn't look like it has much to do with dressing yourself or getting dressed or any of those things. That's because this actually maintains that original meaning of the word dress that we don't really use anymore, that meant straightening a horse out. That's all that really meant originally. It didn't have to do with clothes. It had to do with training, and that's where dressage comes from. So you can see these connections being made when you dig back into the etymology. It all starts to become clear. Another thing that French did with this root, going all the way back to late Imperial Latin, is they made and again, I'm not just talking about the French here, I'm talking about all the later Latin speakers in the Roman Empire. They put another preposition onto the front of it. They made this compound even compoundier, and yes, I just invented that word. So direct-iare means to direct or to straighten or to guide or something like that, but ad is another Latin preposition that means to or toward. So if you ad-di-rect-iare something, then you're directing something toward somebody, or you're straightening somebody towards something, which is not that big of a difference from dress, but it gives us a whole nother family of words. You probably guessed this is where we get address from. So if you address something as a verb, you are directing it. All right. So when Abraham Lincoln decided to address people at Gettysburg, he was directing a speech toward them, and that's what address literally means. If you address something like a letter, you are, of course, directing it to somebody, so you can see how that would mean that. As a noun, it's just the noun version of everything I just said. The Gettysburg Address as a noun is one particular instance of words being directed towards somebody, and an address on an envelope, for instance, is something that aids in directing something to or toward. There's that ad that got added in late Latin. So really, there's a lot going on here from this one compound in Latin, direct. Let's look at one more set of compounds in Latin to sort of finish this out. Let's talk about insurrection. Now, you may not have thought that insurrection was related to this, but when I break it down like this on your screen, you can see that the rect root is clearly there. So let's talk about what these words mean. I mentioned a little bit earlier that in can mean two different things in Latin. This is the in that just means in or into, but then even way back in classical Latin, this could already mean something a little more involved. If you go into a group of people in a hostile fashion, then you're going against them. So a semantic evolution of in Latin could be against. And in this particular case, in this particular compound, insurrection, it really does mean against. So let's translate it against here. The sur is from sub. You already know what this means if you speak English, because we totally just stole sub from Latin. We use it in all sorts of contexts, sub-zero temperature, sub whatever, right? Sub was just a Latin word. They would pronounce it sub, that meant below or underneath. A similar thing is happening here where that B is becoming an R before the R. It's a process of assimilation, just like we saw with Cor-rect being Cor-rect after the process of assimilation happened. So the sur part is sub. Then we have rect, which of course means to straighten, and then the shun ending, which would have been to in Latin before French palatalized it, is just a noun ending there. So when you put all of these things together, what does an insurrection literally mean? It's a straightening out from underneath against those who are above. That's literally what an insurrection is. A way that you can kind of massage that into a good English translation is it's an uprising. You're rising up, and that's what you're doing when you take part in an insurrection. There's the same sort of metaphorical idea here that we saw in erect, where if you're straightening from a particular place, the ground is kind of the reference point, so it can mean to rise up in this particular sense, and that's really what's going on here. If you are participating in an insurrection, what kind of person are you? You might be called an insurgent, and this actually, of course, comes from the same Latin root. And as you can see, I've broken it up here. Insur, we have the reg part because it's actually coming from the verb rego and not the participle with the rect or anything that's getting a T added ultimately. And then this ent ending is just a participle ending. So it's like an ing ending in Latin. So an insurgent is a rising up person, a person who is rising up against those who are above them, an upriser, if you want to translate it that way. One more slide and one more set of French shenanigans to talk about here. Let's see what French did with this particular verb. So an insurrection comes from this verb. If you take the in off, it's sur-reg-iare, which even in Latin times was already being smashed together a little bit to surgere. So Old French already had this verb stem, surg, surge, which meant to rise up or to spring up, and this comes from sur plus the reg-root. Of course, as you can probably guess, we get surge from this, and it ultimately comes from this Middle French word that had a water metaphor involved. So it originally meant something like a spring, a place that water rises up out of the ground. It has an insurgency out of the ground, if you want to attribute that kind of agency to water. So that's where surge comes from. It could mean water rising up out of the ground like a spring, and it could also mean a surge of water, say the waves in an ocean or something like that. One more word we get from this root in French is source. Source comes from this Middle French word source or something like that. That meant rise, beginning spring. So it has the same metaphor there. It's a place that water rises out of the ground. So the source of a particular creek or stream or even river might be a spring. And so the original meaning of the word source was specifically referring to water rising up out of the ground in a particular place. It is sub-reg-ing. It is straightening itself out or rising from under the earth. And that's the sub part that you can kind of see there. So there you go. We get words like surge and source ultimately from the reg root, and the reg root has been hiding in there all along, even though you probably never would have seen it until you looked into it. Okay, that finishes our safari, our two-part safari on the reg root. We've had a lot to talk about. We made a lot of connections. I'd love to hear what you thought was the most interesting. There is a lot of material here. See you next time.